The cotton field stretched out before the Harris plantation like a sea of green and gold, the earth warm beneath the heavy summer Sunday. The house, with its whitewashed walls and tall pillars, stood like a monument to the wealth that had been built on the backs of the enslaved. But inside, behind the curtains of polished wood and fine china, another story was unfolding. A story of pain, of rage, and of a woman who would soon take back everything she had lost. Sarah had spent years in silence, watching, waiting. She had served Margaret Harris since the day she had arrived at the plantation. A young girl then, full of hopes and dreams that had been quickly crushed beneath the weight of her mistress's cruelty. The Harris family was wealthy, entitled, and utterly indifferent to the suffering they caused. Margaret Harris, in particular, was a woman whose beauty and wealth masked the viciousness of her heart. She was a woman who wielded power over those beneath her without a second thought, and Sarah had long ago learned to keep her head down, to do as she was told, and to bury her anger deep within. But that anger had grown over the years, nurtured by the countless cruelties Margaret had inflicted on her and the other enslaved people of the estate. She had witnessed the abuse, the broken bodies, the endless suffering of those who had no voice, no hope. And through it all, Sarah had been silent until tonight. Now, standing in the shadows of the house, Sarah could feel the heat of the night pressing in on her. The air thick with the smell of magnolia and the distant hum of the river. The moment was coming. The plan she had quietly put into motion over the last few months was ready. Tonight, Margaret would pay for the years of suffering she had caused. Sarah would be the one to make her answer for the pain she had inflicted on so many. Before we step into this final chapter of Sarah's story, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Drop a comment, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hiding in the shadows for far too long. Sarah had been with the Harris family for longer than she cared to remember. When she first arrived, just a girl barely older than a child, she had been filled with fear and awe at the grand plantation house, at the polished floors and the delicate porcelain cups that lined the dining room. The other enslaved people whispered stories about the family, about Margaret, and about the kind of woman she was. They told Sarah to keep her head down, to do her work and stay out of the way. They told her not to trust Margaret, and they were right. At first, Sarah had done what they told her. She had worked quietly, her hands moving quickly, her head lowered as she cleaned, cooked, and served. But over the years, she had begun to understand what the others meant. Margaret Harris was not just cruel to the enslaved. She was indifferent to them. She treated them as little more than animals, her commands sharp and cold, her punishments swift and brutal. There had been the time Sarah was punished for spilling a drink in the dining room, a small mistake, one that could have been easily overlooked, but Margaret had slapped her across the face in front of the guests, leaving a red mark that burned more than the sting of her hand. Sarah had cried in silence later, her tears not just from the pain, but from the deep humiliation of being nothing in the eyes of the woman who owned her. But Sarah had been strong. She had survived. She had learned to hide her feelings, to bury the pain beneath the surface where no one could see it. She had learned that in this world, survival meant silence. But there was one thing she could not silence, no matter how hard she tried: her love for Emily, her mistress's young daughter. Emily had been just a baby when Sarah first arrived at the plantation. She had been small, helpless, with big brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Sarah had been tasked with caring for the girl, feeding her, changing her, singing her lullabies at night when Margaret was too busy with her social affairs to bother. Emily was different from her mother. She was sweet, innocent, and unaware of the cruelty that surrounded her. In the quiet moments when Sarah held Emily in her arms, she had imagined a different life for the girl, a life where she would not grow up to become another privileged tyrant like Margaret. She had seen the potential in Emily, the spark of kindness that made her different from her mother. But that potential was threatened by the world she was born into. Margaret had already begun to teach Emily the ways of the plantation, how to view the enslaved as nothing more than tools to be used. Margaret had even started to teach Emily how to wield the power she had over them, her small hands learning how to command those who had no choice but to obey. And yet, Sarah had continued to care for the child, to love her with a fierce devotion. She had done everything in her power to shield Emily from her mother's cruelty, even if it meant taking on more work, more abuse, more humiliation. For years, she had kept her mouth shut, obeying Margaret's every command, all the while nurturing the secret love she felt for the girl. But now, that love had become a prison. Sarah could no longer stand to watch Emily grow up under the same roof as a woman like Margaret. She could no longer bear to see the child turn into another tool for the plantation's wealth, another cog in the machine of oppression. Tonight, it would end. Sarah had waited for this moment for too long. She had watched, quietly and patiently, as Margaret's cruelty continued unchecked. And now, she had a plan. She had sharpened the blade she would use, the same one she had taken from the kitchen, the same one she had hidden away for months. It was a small blade, but it was sharp, and it would be quick. There was no time for hesitation. Her heart beat steadily in her chest as she moved through the house, preparing for what was to come. She knew that Margaret would be sleeping beside Emily, as she always did. She knew that the woman would be vulnerable, unaware of the danger that had come for her. Tonight, Sarah would take back the power that had been stolen from her. The power to control her own fate. Tonight, she would free herself, and she would free Emily. The night was thick with the kind of silence that only comes after a storm has passed. The soft rustling of leaves outside the window and the distant hum of crickets were the only sounds that filled the air of the Harris plantation. Inside the house, the oppressive stillness hung like a veil over the sleeping estate. The grand mansion, with its sweeping columns and fine furnishings, seemed almost unreal in the quiet. But for Sarah, the stillness was not a comfort. It was the calm before the storm. She had spent the evening preparing, every motion deliberate, every decision calculated. The servants' quarters were unusually quiet as the others went to bed, unaware of what was about to transpire. The oppressive weight of the plantation, its brutality, its silence, its suffocating demands seemed to hang over her shoulders like a yoke. But tonight, that yoke would be shattered. Sarah paused in front of her small, simple cot, her eyes scanning the room. She had little in terms of material wealth, just a few worn-out dresses, a small bundle of personal belongings. Her life, like that of all enslaved people on this plantation, had been defined by the possessions of others. Her value had never been her own. It had always been in the hands of those who owned her. She had been defined by their cruelty, by their whims, by their brutality, but that was about to change. She picked up the small, sharp knife she had hidden in the folds of her apron. It was a tool meant for cutting vegetables, for slicing meat in the kitchens. But tonight, it would be a tool of liberation, a tool of final justice. She held it in her hand, feeling the coolness of the metal against her palm, steadying herself. The weight of the blade was nothing compared to the weight she had carried for years. Margaret Harris, as always, had retreated to her room early, where she would sleep beside Emily, her child. In her selfishness and arrogance, she had never noticed the growing resentment, the quiet fury of the woman who had raised her daughter, the woman who had, for years, been forced to endure her cruelty in silence. Sarah moved quickly and quietly through the hallways, her eyes scanning the dim light, her heart beating steady, each thud matching the rhythm of her thoughts. She had made this plan 1,000 times in her mind. She had imagined it, rehearsed it, even dreamed of it. But never had she thought it would feel so cold, so final. It was not anger that drove her. Now it was something deeper. It was the culmination of years of pain, of humiliation, of watching her people suffer while the wealthy continued to live in luxury. It was the realization that she was no longer willing to be a victim. Sarah stopped just outside Margaret's room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see inside. Margaret lay in her large bed, her pale skin glowing in the soft light of the moon that filtered through the window. Emily, her sweet, innocent child, was curled up beside her, her tiny form a world away from the evil that had shaped the life of the woman lying next to her. It was strange, really, how much Sarah had come to love Emily. The little girl, with her bright eyes and soft laugh, had always been a bright spot in the otherwise dark existence that Sarah had lived. She had watched Emily grow from a baby into a young child, and in those moments, when she had held the girl in her arms, Sarah had dared to hope. But the hope had always been fleeting. Emily was part of the system that oppressed Sarah, and soon, she would be part of a world where that system would no longer exist. In the quiet of the night, Sarah's hand moved to the knife at her waist, her fingers brushing the handle, the metal cool beneath her touch. She knew what had to be done. Margaret's cruelty had gone on too long. Sarah had put up with it for too long, but no more. The thought of the years of torture, the years of watching Emily learn from her mother's indifference to the enslaved, tore through her like a storm. Emily was only a child, but she was being groomed to become just like Margaret. A part of Sarah ached for the girl she had loved, the girl she had cared for, but she knew this was the only way to save her. Sarah slipped silently into the room, the floorboards creaking softly underfoot, but not enough to wake Margaret. She stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on the sleeping woman. Margaret's back was turned, her breathing deep and slow. Her pale skin, so beautiful in the moonlight, seemed to shimmer with a false purity. It was the same face Sarah had seen in the mirror. Every day for years, the face of a woman who had caused so much harm, yet never had to suffer the consequences. She took one slow step forward, feeling the air thicken with every movement. The room was quiet, save for the soft sound of Margaret's breath. Sarah stood over her for a long moment, watching, waiting. She was not angry now. She was calm, as though the act she was about to commit was something she had always known would happen. It was inevitable, just as her years of suffering had been inevitable. The knife, sharp and cold, was in her hand. It was small, but it was enough. She took one more step toward the bed, her heart beating faster, but still steady. The moonlight illuminated the blade for a moment, a brief flash of cold metal. And then Sarah moved, silent as a shadow. In one swift motion, she sliced through the night, cutting through the skin of her mistress's throat as though it was nothing more than paper. The blade met its target with precision, the wound deep and fatal. Margaret gasped, her eyes shooting open in a flash of panic, but it was too late. The blood flowed, thick and dark, soaking the sheets beneath her. Emily woke with a soft cry, her innocent eyes wide in confusion and fear. But before she could scream, Sarah was there, her hand on the little girl's mouth, her touch gentle but firm. She shushed her softly, holding Emily close, rocking her in her arms as Margaret's life drained away in front of them. "Shh," Sarah whispered softly. "It's over. You're free now." But freedom, Sarah knew, came at a price. And tonight, that price had been paid in blood. Sarah held Emily close, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she rocked the child gently in her arms. The sound of Margaret's final, gurgling breath still echoed in the room, but the silence that followed felt almost unbearable. Margaret's body lay lifeless on the bed, her once beautiful features now contorted in a grotesque expression of shock and pain. The blood from the fatal wound soaked through the sheets, staining the pristine white fabric with the unmistakable crimson of death. Emily, wide-eyed and trembling, clung to Sarah's side, her small body stiff with confusion and fear. The child had seen the blood, heard the screams, but she had not fully understood what had just happened. To her, the world had shifted in an instant. The woman she had known as her mother was gone, and in her place, there was only this stranger holding her, this woman who had killed the one person who had raised her, the woman who had once cared for her. For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. The weight of what she had just done pressed down on her chest like an iron chain, threatening to crush her. She had taken a life, yes, but in doing so, she had freed herself and Emily from the cruelty that had bound them both. But freedom came with consequences, and now, as Sarah stared at the lifeless body of her mistress, she knew there was no turning back. She stroked Emily's hair softly, her voice a low, soothing whisper. "Shh. It's okay, Emily. Everything is going to be okay now." The child's eyes searched Sarah's face, and for a moment, Emily seemed to recognize her, the woman who had always been there, the one who had fed her, clothed her, and cared for her when no one else did. But even that recognition seemed fragile, like something that could shatter with a single word. Emily didn't speak. She didn't cry out. She simply looked at Sarah, her tiny brow furrowed with confusion, as though she were trying to process the chaos unfolding around her. Sarah's heart ached for the girl. She had done this to protect her, yes, but Emily had been forced to witness something that no child should ever have to see. Sarah had always known that Emily would grow up to be a part of the system that oppressed them, but she had never wanted this for her. She had wanted to shield the girl from the horrors of the world Margaret had crafted. But now, in the wake of her act of vengeance, Sarah realized that Emily would carry the weight of this night with her for the rest of her life. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on Sarah's chest, and for a moment, she considered what might happen next. The sounds of the plantation outside were distant, muffled by the thick walls of the house. The servants were likely still asleep, unaware of the death that had occurred just down the hall. But that would not last. Soon, the plantation would wake to the sound of Mr. Harris's fury, to the chaos that would follow the discovery of Margaret's body. And when that happened, Sarah knew she would have to leave. She would have to run. Emily looked up at her, her small face still filled with confusion. "Where's Mama?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper, as though she were afraid to speak too loudly. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, the truth of it sinking deep into her soul. Emily's mother was gone, and Sarah had taken her place. But how could she explain that to the child, explain the reasons behind her actions? How could she make Emily understand that what she had done was not just an act of violence, but a desperate attempt to save both of them from a life of cruelty and pain? "She's gone, Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, child. But you're free now. You'll be safe." Emily didn't speak again. Instead, she curled further into Sarah's arms, her small body trembling as she processed the weight of Sarah's words. Sarah held her close, her mind racing as she considered what to do next. The only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't stay here. If the overseers or Miss Harris discovered what had happened, the entire plantation would be in an uproar. She would be hunted down, her life taken in retaliation for Margaret's death. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Emily, too, would be swept up in the madness, that the child she had sworn to protect would be dragged back into a world of suffering and cruelty. But Sarah wouldn't let that happen. She kissed the top of Emily's head gently, her mind already forming a plan. "We have to go, Emily," she murmured. "We have to leave now." Emily, still clinging to her, nodded silently, as though she understood. Sarah stood, carefully lifting the child in her arms, and moved toward the door. The weight of the night was heavy, but her resolve was stronger. She had freed herself from Margaret's tyranny, and now she would free Emily too. The world outside the walls of the plantation was dangerous. But it was the only world that mattered now. As Sarah stepped into the hallway, her mind raced with thoughts of escape. She had made plans, gathered what little she needed, and memorized the routes that would lead them to freedom. The Underground Railroad was their only hope now. She knew the risks, knew that every step she took would be fraught with danger. But it was the only chance they had. She walked quickly down the hall, past the rooms of the other servants, and toward the back door. She could already hear the first stirrings of the morning outside, the faint calls of the workers in the fields, the sounds of the household beginning to wake. But none of that mattered now. Margaret was gone, and with her, the power she had held over them all. As Sarah stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the plantation lifted off her shoulders, and she began to run. The night was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of the river as Sarah slipped through the quiet, moonlit woods surrounding the Harris plantation. Her heart pounded in her chest, matching the rhythm of her footsteps. But she dared not slow down. Emily's small, trembling form rested against her chest. Her face pressed into Sarah's neck as they moved swiftly through the underbrush. The child's body, though light, seemed heavier with every step, and Sarah's arms ached as she carried her. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't afford to. The plantation house lay behind them, dark and silent now, though Sarah knew it wouldn't be for long. The noise would come soon, shouts, footsteps, the sound of bells ringing for the overseers. The discovery of Margaret's body would send a shockwave through the entire estate. But by then, Sarah and Emily would be long gone. They had crossed the boundary of the plantation in less than half an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. The sound of the Harris estate, the laughter, the cruel orders, the clinking of expensive glassware faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet hum of the night. It was an eerie, almost sacred silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah had never known such stillness, but in the silence, she could still hear the echo of Margaret's final breath, still feel the sharpness of the blade cutting through her throat. It was a memory that would haunt her, but one she knew she had to carry. "Shh, it's okay, Emily," Sarah whispered, trying to calm the child. Emily had been quiet for the most part, but her small, shuddering breaths told Sarah she was scared. She didn't understand everything that had happened, but she knew enough to feel the weight of it. The young girl clung to Sarah tighter, her hands pressing into her mother figure's chest. "What's going to happen now, Miss Sarah?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where are we going?" Sarah's heart broke at the sound of Emily's voice. She had never thought of the child as anything but innocent, but now, in the midst of all this chaos, she was a part of it. And Emily had no idea what kind of world she was stepping into, a world where there was no longer a mistress to shield her, no longer a place of comfort. But Sarah would give her that comfort, no matter what it took. "We're going to be safe, Emily," Sarah whispered, forcing a calmness into her voice she did not truly feel. "We're going to a place where no one can hurt you anymore." Emily sniffed, her small, damp face lifting to look at Sarah, confusion and fear written across her features. "I don't want to leave, Miss Sarah. I want to stay in my bed with Mama." Sarah's throat tightened at the mention of Margaret. She knew it would be hard for Emily, for the girl to understand why things had to be the way they were. The mother Emily had known had been a woman full of cruelty, but she was still the only mother Emily had ever known. Margaret's legacy, her influence, was now a part of the girl, an influence that Sarah had hoped to shield her from, but one she could not erase completely. "I know, sweet girl," Sarah whispered softly, brushing a few stray curls from Emily's forehead. "But your mama, she wasn't the kind of person who could protect you. I'm going to protect you now. You'll see. I promise." Sarah didn't know where they would go once they reached freedom. She only knew that she had to get them both out of Georgia, far away from the plantation, from the overseers, from any place where their names might be known. The Underground Railroad was their only hope, and while Sarah had learned bits and pieces about it, she knew that it would take everything she had to navigate the journey. But the world was different now. Margaret was dead, and Sarah was free to carve out a life for herself and Emily. As they traveled further into the woods, Sarah felt the oppressive weight of the plantation lift from her shoulders, even as her fear grew. The world outside these woods was unfamiliar, dangerous, and vast, but for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of something better. The stars above seemed brighter, the air sweeter. There was a chance, however small, that they could make it. But Sarah couldn't afford to think too far ahead. The journey was long, and there were too many dangers in the dark, waiting for them. The woods seemed endless. They pushed on, Sarah's body aching with fatigue, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. The light of the moon above them offered little more than the faintest guidance, but Sarah was determined to make it. She thought of the rumors she'd heard about the railroad, about how it was run by abolitionists who risked their lives to help those seeking freedom. The stories were few and far between, but they were enough to fuel the fire in Sarah's heart. She had heard that certain safe houses, run by sympathetic families, dotted the landscape like stars in the night sky. They offered refuge, food, and sometimes even a way to travel farther north, where the risk of being caught was lower. She would find those places. She would keep moving, keep hiding, keep protecting Emily from the dangers that stalked them. "We're going to make it, Emily," Sarah whispered again, more to herself than the girl in her arms. "We're going to be free." But as they continued to move through the thick woods, Sarah knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Their freedom was not guaranteed, and there were many obstacles ahead. There were slave catchers who would stop at nothing to reclaim runaway slaves, and there were bounty hunters who would be more than willing to collect the reward for bringing them back. But none of that mattered now. Sarah had already crossed a line. She had taken Margaret's life to free herself, to free Emily. And in doing so, she had unleashed something that could never be contained. She stopped for a moment, letting the weight of the decision sink in. But then she heard its footsteps, faint but unmistakable. The sound of someone approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. Emily instinctively clutching at her neck in fear. Sarah's first instinct was to hide, to drop to the ground and vanish into the night. But there was nowhere to go. The moonlight cast long shadows over the path, and the figures were moving quickly, gaining ground. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered urgently, crouching down with Emily in her arms. The footsteps grew louder, each thud of boots on the hard earth echoing in Sarah's ears like a drumbeat of dread. Emily, still trembling in Sarah's arms, pressed her face into Sarah's chest, trying to stifle her sobs. Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm, her breath steady, her mind working quickly through the possibilities. The sounds came closer, the crunch of dried leaves underfoot unmistakable. They weren't far behind. Sarah's first instinct was to run. But the woods offered no shelter. There was no way to outrun them in this open terrain, not without a head start. If they had followed the tracks left behind by Sarah's footsteps, if they were tracking her, she would have to think of something else, something clever, something that could buy her time. "Stay still," Sarah whispered into Emily's ear. The child nodded, her small body shaking in fear. Sarah could feel the girl's heart pounding against her own, but she couldn't afford to let Emily's fear infect her. She had to be strong. For both of them. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped, as if the pursuers had paused to listen. Sarah could hear them breathing, hear their muttered words, as they consulted with each other. There were at least two of them, perhaps more. She couldn't risk being discovered now. Sarah's hand went to the knife at her side, her fingers curling around the handle, the cool steel, a reminder of the consequences she had already faced, the act of vengeance she had committed. She had no doubt that these men would show no mercy. They would take her back to the plantation, drag her through the mud, and let her suffer for what she had done, and Emily would suffer right along with her. She could hear them moving again, closer, their boots scraping against the ground, the rustle of their coats as they parted the branches of the bushes. They were just on the other side of a thick line of trees, only yards away from her hiding place. If they found her, they would bring the wrath of the plantation down on them both. The overseers would be waiting. The rest of the enslaved people would be questioned, and it wouldn't take long for the truth to come out. She and Emily would be trapped once again. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to make a decision. The sounds of their footsteps were becoming clearer, more distinct. She couldn't stay hidden forever. In a flash of inspiration, Sarah did the one thing she knew could give them a fighting chance. She rose quickly, grabbing Emily and hurrying to the side, moving as quietly as possible toward a small stream that ran through the woods. The sound of rushing water was loud enough to mask their movements. If they could get to the stream, if they could cross it and leave no trace of their passage, they might just have a chance to escape. "Come on, Emily," Sarah urged, her voice hushed but firm. "We have to move fast." Emily nodded, but her steps were slow, hesitant. She was scared, her small hand clutching Sarah's tightly. Sarah had to keep moving, had to keep going. For Emily's sake. If they stopped now, they were finished. The stream was just ahead. Sarah could see the glimmer of water beneath the trees, the moonlight catching on the surface. It wasn't deep, just a few feet wide, but it would be enough to cover their tracks. She urged Emily forward, her heart pounding in her chest as they reached the bank. The sound of the men's voices was growing louder, but they still hadn't spotted her. Sarah reached the water first, stepping into it with one foot, then the other, guiding Emily through the shallow stream. The cold water soaked through her shoes, sending a chill up her spine. But it didn't matter. They had to keep moving. As they crossed, Sarah glanced over her shoulder, just in time to see a figure emerge from the trees, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. One of them had found the trail. Her stomach dropped as the man looked directly at her, his eyes narrowing. He had seen them. Without thinking, Sarah pulled Emily along, moving faster, her feet splashing in the water as she ran. She knew she didn't have much time. The man was shouting now, calling for the others, and soon the entire pursuit would be after them. "Run, Emily, keep up!" Sarah urged, her voice frantic. The child's tiny legs struggled to keep pace, but Sarah didn't have time to slow down. She had to put as much distance between them and the plantation as possible. She had to get Emily out of here, away from the men who would never stop hunting them. Behind them, Sarah heard the sound of boots splashing in the water, the men closing in. The pursuit was relentless, but Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She had to keep moving, had to get them to safety. The trees began to thin, and ahead Sarah saw a thick patch of underbrush, a place where they could hide, a place where the moonlight didn't shine as brightly. They could rest there, catch their breath, and figure out their next move. "Just a little farther," Sarah whispered, pushing Emily ahead of her. But the world seemed to close in. The sound of the men's pursuit grew louder, closer. It was only a matter of seconds before they would be upon them. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. Not now. And then, just as the men were about to catch up, a distant shout rang out from the woods ahead. It was a voice Sarah didn't recognize, but it was unmistakable, a cry for help. The men paused, confused by the shout, their attention momentarily diverted. Sarah's eyes widened in realization. This was the moment they had been waiting for. She pushed Emily forward, her voice urgent. "Run, Emily, keep going." With a final push, they burst through the underbrush and into the safety of the shadows, where the sounds of the pursuit faded into the distance. Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. The night was full of danger, and their flight was far from over. But for now, they were alive. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and distant thunder, the kind of night where the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The woods that had been so dark and threatening now felt almost like a refuge, though Sarah knew the danger wasn't over. Every step she took, every breath she took, carried the weight of their choices. She had done what was necessary. She had killed Margaret, but that wasn't the end. No, it was just the beginning of a long, dangerous road ahead. Emily, exhausted and silent in her arms, had finally fallen asleep as Sarah carried her through the thick forest. The child's small, trusting face was now relaxed, free from the confusion and fear that had consumed her moments before. But Sarah knew that this fragile peace wouldn't last long. Soon, Emily would wake, and the reality of their situation would settle in, a reality where nothing was certain. The path ahead was obscured by shadows and uncertainty. Sarah had heard the stories of the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and secret routes that had helped many enslaved people escape to freedom. But those stories felt like distant dreams now. The reality was harsher. The journey they were on was long and filled with dangers, slave catchers, bounty hunters, and the looming threat of betrayal from people who would sell them out for a reward. But for now, they were still free, and that was something to hold on to. The night stretched on, and Sarah moved cautiously through the underbrush, her senses heightened, her mind constantly alert. She had memorized the routes, had learned the signs, the subtle markings on trees, the hidden paths known only to those who dared to escape. She had to trust in those signs now, for they were her only guide in this unfamiliar world. Hours passed before Sarah found a small clearing, a place where the trees parted just enough to let the moonlight through. She set Emily down gently on a soft patch of grass, her arms sore from carrying the child so far, but she knew they couldn't rest for long. The night was too dangerous, too full of unknowns. They needed to keep moving, keep pushing forward. The sound of crickets filled the silence, a reminder of the quiet stillness of the world around them. For a moment, Sarah sat back on the ground, her breath coming in heavy gasps, her body aching from the strain of their escape. She couldn't relax, not yet. But in the stillness of the woods, as Emily slept, Sarah allowed herself a moment to reflect. They had crossed a line. They had done something that would change their lives forever. Margaret was gone, and though Sarah knew it was an act of justice, it had come at a great cost. What would the future hold for them now? They had no home, no protection, and no allies. The world beyond the plantation was just as harsh, just as unforgiving. But Sarah had made a promise to herself and to Emily that she would never let them be trapped again. They would survive. They would find a way to live free. As Sarah sat in the clearing, her thoughts scattered and heavy, she began to hear something new, the sound of footsteps. Light at first, almost imperceptible, but then growing louder. Sarah's heart stopped. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her side. The pursuers were closing in, again. She had thought she might have outrun them, but they were still out there, hunting them down. Her mind raced as she glanced around, looking for an escape route. The sounds of the night seemed to fade away as the footsteps grew nearer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she turned her head toward Emily, who was still sleeping, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the clearing, and then, through the trees, a voice called out softly, "Hello?" Sarah's body tensed, but she didn't move. She waited, unsure of whether to speak, unsure of who was on the other side of the trees. If it was a threat, she would fight. If it was help, she would have to trust them. But trust had never come easy for Sarah. In her world, trust was something that could betray you as quickly as a blade to the throat. "Hello?" the voice repeated, this time closer. Sarah's heart raced, but her posture remained rigid, her muscles coiled, ready for whatever came next. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. The fear and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her words, but she couldn't afford to be anything but vigilant. The figure emerged from the shadows, and Sarah's breath caught in her chest. Standing in front of her, under the cover of the trees, was a tall man, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was alone, and his eyes, though kind, held an intensity that made Sarah hesitate. "I heard the child," he said softly, his voice calm. "I saw the lights. Are you in need of help?" Sarah studied him carefully, but she did not let down her guard. She knew nothing about this man. He could be a threat, or he could be her salvation. She had learned long ago not to trust the kindness of strangers. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah replied cautiously, her voice cold, defensive. "What do you want?" "I want to help you," the man said, his voice steady but with a clear sense of urgency. "I know who you are. I know what happened. You've made it this far, but you won't make it alone." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. The weight of his words sank into her chest, the reality of their situation crashing back into her mind. She couldn't do this alone. She knew that. She had made it this far, but her luck wouldn't last forever. He extended a hand toward her. "I can take you to a safe house. You'll be hidden. You'll be protected. You and the girl." Sarah looked at his hand, then at Emily, who still slept soundly beside her. The child was unaware of the danger, unaware of the weight of the choice Sarah had to make. Emily was the reason Sarah had done all of this. And now, as the man stood before her, offering an escape, Sarah realized that the future she dreamed of might just be within her grasp. "Who are you?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but insistent. "Someone who can help you," the man replied. "The question is, will you trust me?" Sarah's heart raced. She knew that trust came at a high price. But at that moment, she also knew that without it, they would have nothing. She had no choice but to take the risk. She had already taken so much from the world, and now, it was time to see if the world would give something back. Without a word, she nodded. She would trust him. She had no other choice. "All right," she whispered. "Show me the way." And with that, Sarah and Emily's journey to freedom continued.